To many left-wing thinkers, Orwell remains an inspiration. They view him as an ally in their cause. But is this really an accurate representation of Orwell? Would it really be the case that if Orwell were alive today, he would be on the side of modern left-wing thinkers? Well, let me read a quote from my favourite of his books, The Road to Wigan Pier. Sometimes I look at a socialist, the intellectual, tract-writing type of socialist with his pullover, his fuzzy hair, and his Marxian quotation, and wonder what the devil his motive really is. It is often difficult to believe that it is a love of anybody, especially of the working class, from whom he is of all people the furthest removed. The underlying motive of many socialists, I believe, is simply a hypertrophied sense of order. The present state of affairs offends them not because it causes misery, still less because it makes freedom impossible, but because it is untidy. What they desire, basically, is to reduce the world to something resembling a chessboard. The truth is that, to many people calling themselves socialists, revolution does not mean a movement of the masses with which they hope to associate themselves. It means a set of reforms which we, the clever ones, are going to impose upon them, the lower orders. Though seldom giving much evidence of affection for the exploited, the socialist is perfectly capable of displaying hatred against the exploiters. Hence the grand old socialist sport of denouncing the bourgeoisie. It is strange how easily almost any socialist writer can lash himself into frenzies of rage against the class to which, by birth or by adoption, he himself invariably belongs. This is why I think Orwell is so great. Yes, he was a democratic socialist and he believed in the things that he was saying, and he was certainly critical of authority and of the status quo at the time. But he was equally sceptical of people who would have called themselves allies of his. He was sceptical of people who wanted to do away with the authority which he was criticizing. And I think this is why the book 1984 remains so powerful, even if the people who find 1984 to be an inspiration today don't understand what it means. 1984 really is a warning against socialist utopia. And this is why I find people who claim to love Orwell so entertaining, because invariably they are exactly the sorts of people who believe the kinds of things which will make 1984 a reality. They are exactly the kinds of people, the sorts of socialists, which Orwell was describing in the passage which I just read to you from The Road to Wigan Pier. I know several people who describe themselves perfectly honestly as communists or very left-wing, and who are also totally prepared to have people censored or even imprisoned for wrongthink, and at the same time they find Orwell to be a central inspiration in their way of thinking. They find 1984 to be one of their favourite books, and yet they can't, for some reason they can't see the total contradiction. The whole point of 1984 was that it was a warning against totalitarian power, against authoritarianism, and yet the people who claim to love Orwell and his work have totally missed the point. Now, make no mistake, Orwell was obviously a democratic socialist, but he was not the sort of socialist which he is describing in the passage I read, and he's certainly not the kind of socialist that you would find today. He was a democratic socialist of the old English order, if you like. He still had the spirit of liberty in him. He believed in England, he was patriotic. He was in many ways socially conservative, actually, even though he was economically more left-wing. But no doubt he believed in many of the principles which today you would have to describe as right-wing. Most of the ideas of freedom of speech, basic liberties, which people on the modern right are trying to defend, are exactly those things which people on the modern left are trying to undermine and destroy. And so when we ask the question, where would Orwell find himself today? I don't think this is just a question like, when you ask this of anyone from the past, you tend to find that they were probably more conservative than than they would be today, if you like. But I don't think that this is just another example of that. I think Orwell really is a different brand of socialist, even of some of the people of his time, clearly, because in that passage from the road to Wigan Pier, he is describing people of his time who are very much like the dominant left-wing force that we find in today's world. And he was not one of those people. And that it is still possible to think like he does. It is still possible to be a democratic socialist who believes in principles of freedom and liberty, and who is, how would you say, against big government, is aware of the threat of totalitarianism which comes from the state. But generally, when people appeal to Orwell and cite Orwell, they are exactly the sort of socialist who Orwell was warning us against. They are, in other words, people who don't love the poor, they just hate the rich. They are guided entirely by resentment and hatred of other people, which is basically the foundation of almost every socialist project on Earth, and all of them have failed. The Soviet Union was essentially founded on a hatred of people with wealth, of people who were better off, a hatred of the kulaks. It was a project to remove people with wealth, with any kind of superiority, not out of a genuine love for the poor, but out of a hatred, a deep hatred and resentment for people who were doing better. And the funny thing is that, like most socialist movements and thinkers, these movements always originate from people who are from the middle class, from people who are already well off, like the socialists George Orwell was describing. They're never peasants, you know. They're never poor people. They're never really from the working class. I heard a story from Peter Hitchens, which was about when he was a Bolshevik and he was trying to recruit people from the working class into his movement. He found that they were generally just not interested. They just found it confusing. They weren't going along with it. All of these socialist movements tend to be formed by middle-class people who are university educated, who aren't as affluent as they would like to be, aren't as prosperous as they would like to be, who resent the prosperity of the people above them, and then try to recruit the working classes to join them in their resentful attempt to overthrow the people who they deem to be the enemies of society. So what does this tell us? I think it tells us that George Orwell was, it goes without saying, George Orwell was a wise man. He recognised that resentment is really the root of all evil in society, just like Solzhenitsyn. And what do we do with that in the modern day? I think what we do is we abandon ideologies which cause us to become more and more resentful and more bitter, and we adopt a kind of stoic attitude which is actually inward looking, not in a narcissistic way, but in a way which calls us to ask ourselves, what can we do? What can I do to make my own life better, and ultimately the lives of the people around me? And eventually, if I'm in a place to do it, if I have the privilege to do it, perhaps even the lives of people in my own country or across the world. This is the opposite of the socialist idea. The socialist idea is top-down power, that we should make the world anew, we should make it perfect, we should design a wonderful utopia by using force from the top to make everyone else conform with our idea of a perfect world. The opposite to that, the opposite to power, is love. And with that comes the self-analysing question of what should I do? What can I do to make myself better? How can I take on more responsibility? How can I become a better person? And I hope that that was the sort of question that George Orwell might have been asking himself and asking of others.